The doctor's notes from the final examination were brief. The heart, he wrote, had migrated, not metaphorically, not in the poetic language of hymns or eulogies. The organ itself had moved from its natural position, displaced by years of sustained, crushing pressure, the kind of pressure that comes not from disease, not from physical trauma, but from prostrating oneself on cold stone floors, night after night, weeping for people who did not know your name. The doctor had never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone in Winnipeg. It was 1907, and the city of Winnipeg had sat at the edge of two worlds. To the east, the established church, stone buildings, Sunday suits, respectable hymns sung in measured tempo. To the west, the prairie, vast and indifferent, and beyond it, waves of new immigrants who had arrived in Canada with nothing except the clothes on their backs and a hunger that had nothing to do with bread. They had come from Ukraine, from Poland, from Russia, from corners of Europe that polite Winnipeg society had never thought about and preferred not to. They lived in the North End. They worked the slaughterhouses. Their children spoke no English. Their names were unpronounceable to the men who ran the missions. Into this city, in the autumn of that year, came a young man named Oswald Gwynne Thornton. He had not been asked to come. No mission board had assigned him. No denomination had sent him with a salary and a letter of endorsement. He came because something had happened to him 2 years earlier in a rented room in Edinburgh that he could never quite explain to anyone's satisfaction. Not even his own. Oswald was 26. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister from Guelph, Ontario, which meant he had grown up surrounded by the language of faith the way other children grow up, surrounded by the language of law or medicine. He knew the vocabulary. He knew the rhythms. He could recite the catechism before he could ride a bicycle, and he had sung the doxology so many times that it played in his head the way a nursery rhyme plays, automatically, without feeling, the way your feet find the stairs in the dark. That was the problem. He knew the words. He did not know the thing the words were pointing at. His father was not an unkind man. He was simply a busy one. 3 services a week, a congregation of 200, a constant round of pastoral visits, committee meetings, correspondence. He moved through the world of faith the way a carpenter moves through his workshop, competently, efficiently, without sentiment. The work was the work. You showed up. You did it. You went home. Oswald watched this and understood it and copied it the way sons copy their fathers. And by the time he was 17, he had become a young man of impeccable religious habit and almost total spiritual emptiness. He told no one. There was no language for it in Guelph. You did not stand up in the Presbyterian church and say, "I do all the right things and feel nothing." You did not confess to your father, who had built his entire life around the right things, that the right things felt hollow. You simply kept doing them and hoped that someday the feeling would follow the form. It did not follow. By the time Oswald reached his 20s, he had begun to suspect it never would. He went to university in Toronto, studied theology with reasonable diligence, graduated with marks that his professors described as solid, which was not the same as inspired. He accepted a position with a missionary society that worked among Scottish immigrant communities in the northern reaches of Ontario and Quebec. The salary was modest. The work was straightforward. He was competent at it. He hated it. Not the people, not the mission. He hated the feeling of himself doing it. The sense that he was performing a function, like a clerk stamping documents, without any deep interior knowledge of what the documents meant. He was in Edinburgh on a furlough visit in the winter of 1905 when something broke open. He had gone to hear a man speak at a small church on the south side of the city. A man he had never heard of, whose name he cannot even reliably recall in later accounts. The room was not impressive. The crowd was modest. The speaker was not particularly eloquent, not by any standard Oswald had been trained to recognize. But the man spoke about prayer in a way that Oswald had never heard spoke about before. Not prayer as discipline, not prayer as duty, not prayer as the proper maintenance of one's relationship with the Almighty. Prayer as wrestling. Prayer as a man who will not let go until daybreak. Prayer is the only honest thing you can do when you have nothing left. Oswald sat very still in that pew for a very long time after the service ended. The other attendees filed out around him. He did not move. Something was cracking inside him. He did not yet know what it was. He went back to his rented room that night, and for the first time in his adult life, he stopped performing. He knelt down on the bare floor, not because it was time for evening prayers, but because he had run completely out of words and postures and approved religious gestures, and he stayed there in silence for a very long time. What happened in that room, Oswald would say later, was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no audible voice, no sensation of electricity moving through him. What happened was quieter than that, and stranger. He became honest. He confessed to no one except the darkness that he had spent his entire life in the architecture of faith without ever once laying his hand on the foundation. He confessed that he did not know how to pray. He confessed that he was afraid. He stayed on the floor until his knees ached and the candle burned down. He went back the next night, and the night after that. By the time he sailed back to Canada 3 weeks later, something in him had changed that he could not measure or name. He only knew that the words felt different now. Not automatic, not hollow. Something had woken up behind them. He arrived in Winnipeg in October 1907, with a trunk, a Bible that was beginning to show its use, and no official affiliation. He had written to the mission board. They had written back with measured encouragement and no concrete support. He had written to his father, who had replied with genuine concern and careful advice about the importance of institutional accountability. He did not wait for the institution. He found a room in the North End, among the people the institutions had not yet reached. His neighbors were a Ukrainian family on his left and a Polish family on his right. And within the first week he discovered that his French, his Latin, and his Presbyterian theology were all equally useless in this context. He spoke English. His neighbors spoke very little of it. He knew hymns. They did not know the hymns. What he knew, which he had not known before Edinburgh, was how to be present. He began simply. He learned words. He sat in kitchens and watched how people moved through their days, what they worried about, what they laughed at. He made himself useful in the ways available to a young man with no money and no credentials. He chopped wood. He helped carry things. He sat with the sick when their families needed to sleep. He did not come with a program. He came with time. In the evenings, he returned to his room and he prayed. This is the part that Oswald himself found difficult to explain in the accounts he gave later, and it is the part that his contemporaries found most difficult to accept. He was not praying in the way that prayer is typically described, the intercessions, the thanksgivings, the structured petitions. He was doing something that looked, to any observer, more like grief. He was taking the faces he had seen that day. The exhausted woman with the sick baby, the man who had lost 3 fingers to the factory machinery, the children who laughed at him in a language he couldn't yet understand. And he was holding them, the way you hold something that is broken and that you cannot fix. And he was weeping. Not dramatically, not performatively. He wept the way a person weeps alone when no one is watching. He began to set his alarm for 2 in the morning. He would sleep from 10 until 2, rise in the dark and cold of the Manitoba winter, and spend the hours until dawn on his knees. He prayed for the North End. He prayed for the families in the tenements. He prayed for the children in the factories. He prayed for the city that ignored them. He prayed until his body gave out and he fell asleep on the floor. And then he rose and went out and did the work again. People began to notice, though not in the way you might expect. They did not notice his theology. They did not notice his denominational affiliation, because he did not have one. What they noticed was something harder to name, a quality of attention. When Oswald sat with you, you had the sense that you were the only person in the world. He was not managing you. He was not processing you through a spiritual program. He was simply there, completely, in a way that felt rare. A woman named Helena, a widow from Galicia, who had arrived in Winnipeg 3 years earlier with 4 children and no English, described it later in a letter that was translated and preserved. She said, "I did not understand anything he said for the first 3 months, but I knew he saw me." That is not a small thing. In this city, many people did not see us at all. The small gathering that formed around Oswald's work did not look like a church. It met in different kitchens on different evenings, sometimes in the back room of a shop whose owner had offered the space because Oswald had helped him move furniture. There were no pews. There were no bulletins. There was someone who could play the piano tolerably well, and someone who knew some hymns in Ukrainian. And there was a man who had brought a portion of the Hebrew scripture memorized from childhood that he recited sometimes in the evenings, and nobody quite knew what denomination that made them, and none of them especially cared. What they had was someone who prayed for them by name. This was not a small thing. The winter of 1909 was the worst Oswald had yet seen in Winnipeg, and he had seen several by then. The cold came in November and did not release until well into April, the kind of cold that gets into the walls of a building and stays there, that makes wood brittle and pipes fail and children sick in waves. The families in the North End were not well equipped for it. The buildings were inadequately heated. The wages from the factories and the slaughterhouses were not enough to cover the fuel bills and the food bills both. Oswald spent that winter in motion, finding fuel, finding food, writing letters to the churches in the south end of the city that had resources, sitting with families where the children had fever, walking the wards of the hospital on Adelaide Street, where the North End families were sent when things went badly. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. The nights he still kept. There is a journal from this period, held now in a small archive at a university in Winnipeg, and it is not an easy document to read, not because the prose is difficult. It isn't. It's plain, almost stark, but because of what it records. It records the names, page after page of names, with brief notes beside them. Mikhailo, sick. 3 children, wife frightened. Anastasia, husband left for the harvest in Manitoba, did not come back, does not know where to write. Bodan, 12 years old, working in the factory, shows up to the evening gathering still smelling of the machinery. And beside each name sometimes a single word, prayed. He did not record his prayers, he only recorded that he had prayed. And then the name appeared again a week later, sometimes 2 weeks later, and beside it, prayed again. His health was declining, he knew it, he did not stop. In the spring of 1910, a doctor from one of the South End churches, a man named Lawrence Graham, who had heard about Oswald's work through a mutual acquaintance, came to the North End to see for himself what was happening. He was not an unsympathetic man, but he was a practical one, and what he saw alarmed him. Oswald was thin. He had a persistent cough that Graham did not like the sound of. His color was poor. Graham asked him directly, "How much are you sleeping?" Oswald said, "Enough." He was not sleeping enough. Graham pressed him on his eating habits, his rest habits, the hours he kept at night, and what emerged from the conversation was a pattern of systematic physical self-neglect that Graham found troubling. Not from any spirit of self-punishment, Graham wrote later, but from something more dangerous than that. A complete absorption in the needs of others to the exclusion of his own. He had, Graham wrote, simply forgotten to take care of himself. The people in the North End needed everything. He was trying to give everything. There was nothing left. He ordered Oswald to rest. Oswald thanked him politely and went back to work. The autumn of 1910 brought something that no one in Winnipeg's North End had expected. Attention. A journalist from the Free Press came to the area on an assignment about immigrant conditions. The standard kind of social concern piece that newspapers ran periodically in this era, full of statistics and cautious sympathy. He found what he expected to find, the crowded tenements, the low wages, the inadequate services. And he found something he had not expected. A young man from Guelph, Ontario, who had been living in this neighborhood for 3 years with no salary and no institutional support, who knew everyone's name, who was still here. The article was not long. It was not the centerpiece of the paper, but it ran, and it was read, and it was noticed. Letters began to arrive. Some were from individuals who sent small amounts of money, a few dollars, which was more than nothing. Some were from churches asking questions. Some were from mission organizations that had become aware of him and wanted to discuss formalizing the work. One was from a man in Toronto who had read the article and wanted to know if Oswald needed volunteers. Oswald read the letters carefully and answered each one by hand, which took time he did not have. He was grateful for the attention. He was also privately frightened of it. He had not come to the North End to be noticed. He had come because the Edinburgh room had cracked him open and something had poured in that he was still not sure he could name, but that had led him here, to these people, to these names in the journal, to the hours before dawn. Fame, even modest fame, felt like a threat to that. But the money was real, and the need was real, and he accepted what was offered and used it carefully. Over the following 2 years, what Oswald's work became, reluctantly, without blueprint, was something that Winnipeg had not quite seen before. It was not a church, though it had the bones of one. It was not a social service agency, though it did social service work. It was a community of people who had, one by one, come to trust a young man who prayed for them by name at 2 a.m, and who had, in that trust, begun to trust each other. Helena, who had arrived not speaking English, was teaching other women to read. Bodan, the factory boy, had found his way into a night school. A man named Theodore, who had arrived in 1908 with a gambling problem that had consumed most of his first year in Canada, had become, with Oswald's persistent and undramatic accompaniment, someone who was fly through it. None of this was miraculous in the obvious sense. None of it involved rooms shaking or fires descending. It was the slower, less visible miracle, people who had been invisible to the city becoming visible to each other. Oswald recorded none of this in the journal. The journal remained what it had always been, a list of names, a record of prayer. He collapsed in November 1912. He was in the middle of an evening gathering, one of the kitchen meetings, this one at the home of a family in the east part of the North End, when he simply stopped in mid-sentence and sat down on the floor. He said, later, that he had not been dizzy, exactly. The words had just run out. His body had reached a boundary and declined to go further. Graham was called. He came within the hour and found Oswald on the floor, propped against the wall, surrounded by people who did not know what to do, but who had, instinctively, stayed with him. Graham examined him there in the kitchen, while Helena held a lamp close and a child stood in the doorway watching with large eyes. The physical findings were not good. Graham sent him to the hospital, which Oswald resisted and won. What the hospital physicians found, over the course of several days of examination, was a body that had been systematically running a deficit for years. The cough was not consumption, which was the first and most feared possibility. It was a function of general exhaustion and exposure. The heart was the more serious concern. It had, by every clinical measurement they could make, been displaced. Not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately life-threatening, but measurably, documentably shifted from its position under the sustained pressure of years of prolonged kneeling, prolonged physical stress, and the kind of sustained emotional labor that the body does not distinguish from physical load. The senior physician on the case was a man who had spent 30 years in medicine and was not given to religious interpretation. He wrote in his notes, "The displacement of the cardiac organ appears consistent with years of extreme physical and emotional strain, the precise nature of which the patient is reluctant to fully specify. He presents no acute condition but is significantly depleted and must be ordered to complete rest." The physician spoke to Oswald directly and told him what he had found. Oswald was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, how long? The physician said he might have 5 years if he rested. He might have considerably fewer if he didn't. Oswald said thank you. He went back to the North End. Not immediately. He spent 6 weeks in rest, which was genuinely the longest period he had stopped moving since Edinburgh. He ate properly. He slept. He did not set the alarm for 2 a.m. Graham came twice a week and monitored him with the expression of a man who knows he is only delaying the inevitable. But when the 6 weeks ended, Oswald returned. He was different, and he was not different. His body was still damaged. His schedule was, for the first time, genuinely moderated. He slept more, he ate more. Graham had made him promise. But the work resumed. The names resumed. The journal resumed, page after page of names with the single word beside them. Prayed. He was 31 years old. The years between 1912 and 1916 are the years that people who knew Oswald Thornton tend to remember as his fullest. The work had grown, inevitably, beyond what one person could hold. There were others now, volunteers from the South End churches, a young woman from Toronto named Frances, who had read the Free Press article and come west, a Ukrainian pastor named Ivan, who had come to faith through the kitchen gatherings, and who was now, himself, a presence in the community who did not need Oswald to be there. This was what Oswald had always been working toward, though he would not have described it in those terms. He was not building an organization. He was not constructing a legacy. He was simply, persistently, turning toward whoever was in front of him, and staying there until something shifted. He had become, by this point, something that Winnipeg did not entirely have a category for. The institutional churches respected him without fully understanding him, the social reformers of the progressive era. And Winnipeg in this period was full of social reformers, deeply serious people with plans and platforms, recognized his work without knowing what to do with his methods. You cannot put prayer on a policy document. You cannot graph the displacement of a heart. The immigrant families of the North End understood him better than anyone. Perhaps because they had not come to Canada with a category for him either. They simply knew what they had experienced. Someone who had shown up, stayed, and kept their names. There is a story that circulates in accounts of Oswald's life. Impossible to verify, as these stories often are, but consistent enough across different sources that it deserves noting. It is said that in the winter of 1914, during a particularly hard period when the factories had cut hours, and the families were again in acute need, a delegation of women from the North End community came to Oswald's room and found him, as they often did, on the floor. They waited. They waited for what one of them described as a very long time. When he finally rose and turned to face them, he was not startled, and he was not embarrassed. He simply looked at them with the expression that many people, trying to describe him, returned to again and again. The sense that he had been entirely elsewhere, and had come back now, and was glad they were there. He died in March 1917. He was 36 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, which was accurate as far as it went. Graham, who had been present at the end, did not add anything to the official record, but he wrote in a private letter to his brother in Hamilton, "The heart gave out, not from disease. I am not certain I have an adequate medical term for what actually wore it through." The funeral was in the North End, in a building that had once been a warehouse and that the community had been slowly converting, over several years, into something that could hold them. It was not a grand building. It had no stained glass. The pews were wooden and mismatched, donated from 3 different congregations who had cleared out their back rooms. The furnace was unreliable. The building was full. Helena was there, and could now speak English well enough to give a short address, which she did, in English and Ukrainian, and the people in the pews understood both. Bohdan was there. No longer a factory boy, now 19, and enrolled in classes at the university, on a partial scholarship that someone in the South End community had quietly arranged. Theodore was there, Anastasia was there, and her husband had, eventually, come back. And they were still together. Ivan was there, and after the service, Ivan stepped forward and said he would continue the work, and the people who were gathered believed him, because they had watched him, and he had been learning at Oswald's side for 7 years. The journal was found in Oswald's room afterward. It was a series of notebooks, not one volume, 4 of them worn, the bindings going soft. They were full of names, hundreds of names, and beside each name, prayed again, prayed on the last page, written in a hand that showed the effort it had taken to form the letters. There was one sentence, not a name, not a prayer notation, just, "I did not save anyone. I simply stayed." There is a question that comes up when you tell someone the story of Oswald Gwynne Thornton. Not always out loud, sometimes just in the look that crosses a person's face while they're listening. The question is, why? Why would a man do this to himself? Why would someone who understood what was happening to his body? And Oswald did understand. After 1912 he understood exactly. Continue in a way that would shorten his life. It is not a question that lends itself to clean answers. What the journal suggests, and what the people who knew him suggest in the accounts they left behind, is that for Oswald the question had been reversed somewhere along the way. The question was not, why continue? The question was, how could you stop? When you have looked into a face and learned its name, when you have held that name in the dark and poured what you had into it night after night, the idea of stopping is not a relief. It is an amputation. He had not come to Winnipeg to save the North End. He had come because Edinburgh had cracked him open, and what had poured in was something that would not let him look away. He stayed 36 years in a body that was not built for what he asked of it. He left behind no institution, no building bearing his name, no theological innovation, no book. He left behind a community of people who knew what it felt like to be prayed for by name at 2 a.m, and who had, because of that, begun to believe that they were worth that. Ivan carried the work forward. Helena's daughter became a teacher. Bowden finished his degree and went north to work in communities the institutions had not yet reached, because someone had shown him that that was a thing a person could do. The journal is in an archive in Winnipeg. It is not often consulted. The names in it are largely unrecoverable. People who passed through a terrible winter in a city that did not notice them, whose names were written down by a man with damaged hands in the small hours of the morning because he believed the names mattered. They mattered to him. They mattered to the people who bore them. Whether they matter to anything larger than that is not a question anyone can answer on their behalf. What the doctor wrote in the file is still there. The heart had moved. It had.